Jamie Hopkins, welcome to the Intelligent Retirement Podcast.
Good to see you. Just with you, but yeah, we're rocking on the podcast today.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to have you here. We recently had the chance to meet up in person finally at the American College's Horizon Conference, and it's probably been, close to a decade that we've been connected on social media. So it's always nice to actually get to connect to somebody else from home as well.
Yeah, it is funny because actually, like you and I, we definitely fall in that group where it feels like we have met because we have a lot of common connections too from right growing up in
Sure.
Baltimore and Charlotte, and it's like how is it that we haven't spent time in person together, but we finally did, so that was good.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a fun fact that Jamie and I grew up very, very close together geographically and both have ties to Charlotte and also Philadelphia. I
Yeah.
know where you are today, and it seems we've sort of led parallel lives a bit to your point, even down to our favorite pizza place, right? So
Yeah, our shout out to Lito's Pizza today.
that's right.
It's great pizza. If you're ever in Maryland, DC area, check it out.
Yeah, it's they don't cut corners, right? So that's the
Yeah.
important part. Well, Jamie, when I was initially putting together a list of topics and industry experts for this podcast, your name was at the top of the list to speak on the subject of risks in retirement. That you've really spent the majority of your career, I think, to this point, educating advisors specifically about some of the risks that are unique to retirement and have become somewhat there. You have become somewhat synonymous with the topic. In fact, isn't your Twitter handle at retirement risks?
Yeah, it still is. My Twitter handle is my Instagram handle is. I forget about that because I never like give out my Instagram handle to people. But when I see it pop up, then I'm like, oh yeah, it's still there. And then my YouTube channel too. I've little bit moved away from it in life, but yeah, like all my social media is still under those handles.
Well, it's a good one. Can you tell the audience a little bit about just your background and how you became interested in this area of risk management, specifically as it relates to retirement?
Yeah, so let me start with I'll go back a little bit in time and try to do it quickly. I got into this whole world really due to my experiences growing up, and it's what set that foundation for what my career and why stories would be. My dad passed away when I was 8 years old. He was a construction worker, passed away on a job site, ran the family business with my mom. And, my mom had to pick up that mantle and carry it forward after that, without having to be the one going up on roofs and hanging gutters. And, so that scarcity and loss that occurred when I was young kind of set this impetus later on when I was older to explore this world and say, like, well, where do people like my mom get advice from? And how did my mom save for retirement? She's never had a 401k or anything like that or a pension, right? She's been a small business owner, like putting her kids through school and putting a roof over their head. And she's 68 and still working and like about to pay off her mortgage. And like that is a lot of America. And so eventually it set me down this journey and, kind of found my way through one thing or another. I worked on one of Bernie Madoff's cases in the appellate division. And American College, right at the time, was looking to launch a retirement program. So they had something at the time, which is kind of gone, but it was called Castle, which is this chartered senior living associate one. And there was some reasons that it went away, and it was a good thing that we landed there. But the initial conversations were about revamping that and making it more like income focused. We ended up scrapping that and starting the Retirement Income Certified Professional RICP, better than the initial retirement income professional designation, RIP, which would have had a whole bunch of issues had we gone forward. But yeah, once you dive into that world and you start looking at the research and talking to retirees and talking to advisors that live in the space, to your point, it became more of this risk management conversation. For most of America, we're really looking at retirement income. It's about making their income sustainable for an uncertain period of time in an uncertain environment, which is mostly about dealing with risks they've never had to deal with before. So that's kind of, the first book I wrote was the 18 retirement risks. And I wrote that for Forbes. And then I wrote a second risk book for Forbes. That whole side of Forbes went defunct at some point. They tried to start this whole like online channel of ebooks and everything, and that they don't exist anymore. So, but it was a fun journey, right? And that's what set that up. We built it into the RICP. And, I kind of went down that pathway of trying to explore these and what are the solutions and how can we equip advisors to help their clients be more secure in retirement.
Well, Thank you for sharing all that. To your point, the American College has put together, and they're still using that list of 18 retirement risks, having been through the RICP program. And my own sort of aha moment around retirement income planning was really that about framing retirement more as a risk management problem than as a rate of return problem. I think it's very typical still even today for a lot of the public to be thinking about retirement as an investment problem to solve, where those of us who are in the profession maybe see that a little bit differently. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, and I'll add even a little further. I mean, it's more of a lifestyle and like human decision process that it is anything else, right? Because the risk management portions, a lot of them in retirement, like we can't really control anyways. So it's like, what do we prepare people for so that they're able to make changes when they need to? I think you might have been in the talk when I was down there at the Horizons, and one of the things I said is, I think the conversation should move around from success and failure, and even to that point, like your investment return conversation, to more of this, like, how willing are you, and what is the likelihood you might need to make changes in retirement? Like that's really the conversation because people are adaptable. When high inflation occurs, we can't control inflation. We can't control even how it impacts our own spending. But what we can do is modify our spending, right? I mean, that's how people react to higher inflation. Is what do? We stop buying as much stuff or we buy different things. Like, so a little bit of the way that we calculate inflation and demonstrate it to clients is nonsensical anyway, because when people stress test high inflationary things and then just assume somebody keeps that stagnant spending adjusted for inflation, I'm always like, but that is truly, just say it, like idiotic, because in any world where like inflation's going up like 7% a year over 30 years, like ain't nobody spending the same at the end of that 30 years. It doesn't even matter if you were a billionaire, you will cut back on your spending and spend differently. Like that is just, that is like how inflation works, right? It's like
Sure,
goes up, people spend less. That's it.
sure.
Yeah. So there's some stuff we do like that just really aren't based in reality. So we have to like come back in the conversations more around, how do you adjust your life at that point? What are you okay modifying on? And that is risk mitigation, right? Because that is saying if we continue on that pathway, you will overspend. You can't generate enough returns and cash flow to continue spending in certain environments. Market drops, inflation goes high, you might be in trouble. You live too long, you've got high medical expenses. These are all scenarios in which you need to figure out what the trade off is and what you're going to adapt to make sure that you have a successful retirement.
Yeah, I like what you said there about preparing. We talk a lot about financial planning and we talk about a lot about making plans, right? Sort of as a noun. But I think your point that the preparation part is probably more important because that makes us think about adaptability, right? Or to your point about how we might change things down the road if the assumptions change, right? That we know, at least initially, where there's a little bit of guesswork involved. Um, and people don't exactly know what they're going to even want to do in the future necessarily, right? When you're talking a few decades down the road.
Yeah, it's not your IQ that's going to get you through retirement. It's your AQ, right? It's your adaptability quotient.
Ah,
That's what's going to get you through. You're going
love
to have
that.
to modify and move and change things, and that's going to allow you to live a better life. And to your point, we don't know what we want to do in 20 years. Some of us get it right, some of us won't. But the world's going to look so different in 20 years than it looks today. You think back about 20 years previous to here, the world looked a lot different. If you look, 50 years ago, it looked tremendously different. So if you're 30 and you're trying to figure out what you're going to do at 85, I mean, that's almost impossible, right? Like there's some core elements, maybe values that you carry through life that will be more consistent. But you do change a lot as a person over life. There are core values that can hold true, like maybe you care about, homelessness and some basic human element of, making sure people have a place to live and be fed. And that might make it your whole life. And maybe your sports team, right? And like those are the two things.
Yeah, right, exactly. So thinking about these 18 risks for our listeners, don't worry, we're not going to go through all 18 of them. They can be grouped really into 8 overarching categories. So what I was thinking we might do is just kind of go through them together and have you share your perspective on each a little bit as someone who's studied them extensively. Does that sound good?
That sounds good.
All right, great. So the first and the big one, or the biggest one maybe, is longevity risk. So how would you assess the risk of outliving one's assets over 30 or more years? And what are the potential consequences on someone's financial security if it's not addressed?
Yeah, so this is one of the, if not the largest one, it's like top three, right? This is in that top three bucket. Interestingly enough, while this was definitely in my book, it's in RSCP, I started changing the way I talked about this one over time, away from being a risk and being a risk exacerbator. But like longevity risk is in and of itself not necessarily a risk. Living a long time is a great thing. It's the winning formula. Like, you are winning here. That's like saying your risk is you're going to make too much money. And you're like, well, then there's complications you get with it. But the risk is not just like you made a bunch of money or you lived a long time. It's then what to do with that. So this is a great thing, but it exacerbates other risks to your point. Like, the when you live a long time, the risk of running out of money is really going up. The risk of needing some type of specialty care like Alzheimer's care, cognitive care, that goes up. The risk of being impacted by inflation goes up, right? Like, all of these other risks start to get exacerbated. I mean, you don't solve all of them the same way, right? Like, some of them are actually kind of like offsetting to some degree too. But you got to go through those and say these risks are now higher. So, how do we provide some steady lifestyle and amount of income for an uncertain period of time? And that's really the biggest challenge about retirement income planning, is that that time period is so uncertain. If we knew it was going to be 16 years, 3 months, and 5 days, we can create a pretty solid retirement income plan. But we don't know if your retirement is going to last 6 hours or 36 years. Now, those aren't equally as likely to occur, but we do have to kind of pay attention to what are the likelihoods that you might be here. Well, statistically, like 50% of people will die early, but like whatever. Like, we're wrong, we're going to be wrong, a coin flip on longevity. Like, we're not going to be super accurate down to any one person. There's macro things we can look at, but that's why it's so hard with an individual. Like, that's why life insurance does mass pooling of people, because if we try to insure one person, it's almost impossible to get it right.
So, just to restate what you said there, that longevity risk is a risk, you said exacerbator, right? Multiplier. It makes it more likely that we are going to encounter all of the other risks, basically, if we live a long time, right?
Yeah.
And I
Yeah,
think
almost
too,
all, right? Except for the risk of dying early, right? That's like the only one we But it's a risk, right? It could be a risk to our spouse, especially when we have two Social Security incomes or a lifetime income source that goes away when one spouse dies. So we do talk about that one sometimes too, right? That early loss of a spouse risk, and then how do you deal with that? And that's like the only one that's really like a flip side of it, right?
sure. Yeah, and it's not a risk to you because you're you're the one that's not here, but it's the surviving spouse. And I think that's an important point because oftentimes we use the word legacy. I think a lot of folks think legacy is children, grandchildren, charities, and sort of skip over the surviving spouse.
Yeah, I mean, because I think most of us don't like to picture that world in which like the person that is our partner or life partner, soulmate, you know, raised our kids or lived our lives together will somehow be here without us, or vice versa, right? Like, that's one we like to ignore as much as possible. People kind of plan around. So, I'm a state attorney by trade. People come into attorneys, like estate attorneys, almost always when something bad has already happened. A friend passes away, somebody gets sick in the family, they get sick, mom or dad die, or somebody dies, and then you're saying, hey, what do we do now? That is the majority of that world. So, especially in the United States, I always say we're a death denying society. We like to ignore it versus celebrate it, right? We don't do as good of a job as that. So, our planning around it's pretty terrible. I mean, somewhere in that kind of 20 to 30-ish%, 33% of Americans, depending on which survey you look at, say they have an estate plan in place. I did a survey of Americans this past fall that I published research on this. And if you really dive into it, we're probably more likely at like 8 to 12% of people actually have an up to date estate plan in place.
Wow.
So we're actually closer to about 90% of Americans do not have an up to date estate plan in place, right? To take care of that situation. What happens to me? And I don't properly leave that legacy to our spouse.
Yeah, that's certainly a problem. I mean, that was one of the risks on the list as far as the family and legacy risk. So, I mean, how do you balance that goal then of securing one's own retirement with the desire to preserve wealth for heirs or for philanthropic causes? What kind of risks come out if those things aren't achieved or aren't addressed properly?
Yeah, and that's a broad space, right? It requires kind of its own conversation. But I think it's super important. I think kind of a way I frame this up sometime is when we talk about retirement, right? We've got the go-go years, the slow-go years, the no-go years. We're kind of familiar with that bucketing of concepts, right? Like, and that they're not equal, not everybody experiences, but it's just the notion that, like, more likely than not, early retirement, you're in better health, move around, do more things. Middle of retirement, you start, aging and frailty starts to sit in. And towards the end of retirement, you're probably less active. And then I always say the thing that comes after that is actually the final act. Right when finality becomes reality and we pass away, and our planning didn't stop then, right? Like there is a whole set of planning that it continues to occur at that moment in time, but a lot of times we kind of lose sight of that in the planning process. We plan for a good retirement. We plan for, a good life. We often don't do enough to plan for a good end of life. And I do think that's important. It is one of the big jobs of the advisory world. I think that we're very well situated for this conversation because we have an ongoing relationship with the client. Estate planning attorneys and attorneys really don't. And so they're not the most suited in the sense to like have this continuing, let's update it. Because most people go to an attorney for their estate plan and then that's it. They might never see them again. So it is a challenging world to say, how do we keep you up to date? So really, I think the advisory world and CFP always preach this too, be that quarterback of the planning here. You're not going to write the will and trust documents, and you probably should not be trustee, but you can do a lot of other stuff, here in coordination of all of this and really make sure it's done. The other big point is for most Americans, and this is a little different. I'll do there and then drive back into our more likely clients. But for most of Americans, end of life planning has nothing to do with money, right? It is entirely to do with making sure that people understand our wishes and our spouses. We leave as few headaches for them as possible when we pass away. I think the average American that passes away has something like $15,000 to $20,000 of net worth at that point. So the average, like median, like they're essentially broke by the time they pass away. Obviously there's people with billions that transfer those out too, but a lot of that transfer actually occurs before the day they die anyway, and it's they're not still holding most of that upon death. So that's a big thing to recognize. My research that I published, and there's a Forbes article about it too, I really focused in on estate planning as a whole, but also this digital estate dilemma, and that there's almost no planning going on around that today. And that doesn't mean like crypto and ether and those types of things. Like the digital asset world is your email and your social media and your Facebook and your X account, and what happens to those when you pass away and your spouse can't get into them and all your bill pay was online and that spouse ran it and it went to their email and you can't get into it anymore? If your documents don't have access to those, right? Under a law called RUFADA, which is in 47 or 48 out of the 50 states now, you likely fall under the terms of service agreements of the service provider. And those basically say this was a lifetime lease and everybody else has no access to it. So that's the end. You can't get into the email. You can't make your bill payout timely. You can't get into your Home Depot account where you have some auto enroll payment thing on there, auto nails show up to your house. Like all of those things can be challenges. And so we really got to move forward and get better at that side of the planning too. But that's just an example of one that's falling through the cracks today. And most Americans, in our survey, I think it was 76% said they were unaware. They've never heard of the topic of digital estate planning. So like, three-quarters of the country can't do any planning because they didn't even know it was a thing.
Yeah, it's one of those unknown unknowns.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a important one. I'm glad you brought that up. But kind of along those same lines, one of the other big headline risks was about the unpredictability and costs of healthcare in the future, right? There's a lot of uncertainty now we're seeing. I expect that to probably continue for a while. How do these expenses impact a retiree's overall financial plan? Maybe if they're in their early 50s, like how should we be thinking about those things if they're not even quite to retirement yet?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. First swing, right? Just bang, knocked it dead. And I think it's the uncertainty about healthcare and where it's going to land. So much of the healthcare world in the United States now is driven by our insurance and reimbursement policies, all the way from Medicare, Medicaid, and our insurance. If you talk to doctors, it used to be you go figure out what's wrong and You prescribe a solution, then you submit it to insurance, and now you see somebody, and then you figure out what insurance covers that they could get help with, right? Like it has really shifted. I'm not ripping on any of it by any means. I'm just saying, like, that's the system that we live in today. Now, will that be the system in 5 years from today? We really don't know. Nobody knows. I think there's a lot of questions about how should Medicare, Medicaid, and our insurance look in the country. But it's been this has been a debate, at least for you and I, our entire lives. I think sometimes we get narrow focused and think this is something that's occurring now. But like the Affordable Care Act came about because insurance premiums were rising at an unprecedented rate in the middle of the 2000s. For all the good and bad that have come out from it, actually, insurance premiums rate rises have significantly declined since Affordable Care Act was actually put in place. So you might have all the issues in the world with Affordable Care Act, but actually that was the main thing it set out to do, was to get those costs a little bit more under control. And I say a little bit more under control because most people are like, they're not under control. Agree. But it was able to flatten out that growth curve, just like we don't get rid of inflation and we really don't make items cheaper again, but you try to slow down the rate of the growth of items moving into the future. And that really is what Affordable Care Act accomplished. And we've now been living under that for, 15 ish years and kind of still waiting. What's the next variation of that? Because no plan should be the final one, right? Like everybody kind of expects to see some point, some variation of that. Now, when you get to the planning side, I do think it's understanding what are their family health history. I think that's important. I think this whole notion of like, is health going to show up in the retirement planning cycle? It's a really interesting conversation. You are starting to see some multifamily and family offices wrap in health services into their engagements, including there's an interesting product out there. I don't have an investment or any part of it. So just anytime I mention a specific thing, it's always good to let people know. It's not me selling you something. But there's that product out there. I think it's called Grail, which is a early detection multi-factor cancer screening. I messed up those words, but some order of them is correct. But essentially, it can screen for numerous cancers earlier than anything before. It's being tested out by, I think, John Hancock perhaps rolled it out. Medicaid or Medicare, one of the two of them is testing it nationally too. And some RIAs and wealth firms have actually rolled it out to their clients.
Well,
So they have videos on their website about a wealth firm where they ran it to one of their high network clients, and he did have a cancer that was undetectable outside of that yet, and ended up getting treatment. And like, more or less, you don't know that for a fact, but like his view in the video was like, my wealth advisor basically saved my life with this test, right? Like, because they're trying it out as a benefit. I think that's a really interesting space because, all the wealth in the world is meaningless if we get sick and die. I'm a big fan of HSAs. If you're in a high deductible and can use it, is build that side pool of money, and that's in a tax efficient vehicle for healthcare costs. You can pay Medicare premiums. I think making sure you're making the right Medicare Part D decision each year, that it really is an annual decision. I just redid my mom's again because I look at that one each year, and hers had really jumped. She had one prescription drug that she was on like quadrupled, and it was probably $1,000 difference for this next year. And you roll out over 30 years and it's 30 grand, right? Like that's a lot then, right?
sure.
Like that's a whole year of retirement distributions by not paying attention to that one thing. So that's important. I'll pause there because it's a lot. I ramble, but super important topic.
It is. It is for all the reasons that you mentioned. And it's one I think that's not necessarily on everybody's radar, right? We think about retirement accounts and some of the administrative logistical aspects of maybe filing for Medicare, but not the actual implications of what happens once you're on it. And so I think that's really good information.
This episode is sponsored by Consolidated Planning. Since 1981, Consolidated Planning has helped families organize, protect, and grow their wealth with its protection first philosophy and unique approach to planning designed to maximize your living standard in retirement. Take the first step toward a more confident financial future by visiting www.cplanning.com. That's the letter C, planning.com. And now, back to our show.
And sort of along those same lines, another of those big headline risks is on the behavioral and the cognitive side of things in terms of decline, frailty, changes in cognitive capabilities and so on in your later years. How can that impact financial decision making, and what risks do these pose to folks who maybe have done the right kind of planning, but get later into life and are perhaps losing their mental faculties.
Yeah, and I mean, look, we just all have to plan for that. We got to accept the fact that that is going to occur to most of us. And so it typically means to me, not everybody agrees with this, but my philosophy is it is why we want to automate as much of these decision points as possible, right? Even probably like your retirement distributions, tax payments, mortgage payments. We don't want to have to be dealing with all those things as we start to age and you miss payments, your power gets shut off, et cetera, right? Like, as much of that as we can automate, I think is really good. I also will argue that communication with our family is super important in this space, that we are clear with what we want to occur, who we want to help, and in what domains of our life we want different people to help, that everybody is aware of it, that we didn't have like one conversation with one kid and a different conversation with another kid. Then something happens to mom or dad and nobody knows who's supposed to step up. If that's your expectation, you have to have that conversation early on and be clear and concise around it. And I think, I've told people, I think it's good to have those conversations when you get people together for holidays. Like at some point, tell people, like, hey, I want to have a 10-minute serious conversation before we get back to everything. And this is what I want. And then you really should be documenting some of that stuff in your legal world. But I talk to people all the time that like, yeah, mom and dad have a will or trust or something. And like, have you seen it? No, I've never seen it. I don't really know. And like, oh, well, I think, Joan's going to be the one that takes care of them if something happens, but nobody's ever had that conversation. And it's important. You have to have these conversations and it can be as simple as, hey, I just want 10 minutes and everybody can sit down and talk about it. So you get everybody on the same page. There's nothing that tears families apart more than fighting over money and responsibilities, either when somebody passes away or somebody needs to go into a home. I mean, you give people permission to spend that money too. I mean, that's another important thing. I've seen that dozens of times where parents have ended up in care facilities and the kids are spending none of the money because they're all thinking like, hey, like if we spend all this, either one, we could run out, or two, we're not going to have it later on when they pass away, and like they view it as theirs. But telling people like, I want you to spend this on me, like not hold it. Or if vice versa, you could tell them like, look, like if I end up in a care facility, I'll take all the money, don't spend any of it. Cause like, I'm okay with that. Like there are people that will say, I know my one uncle would 100% say that, right? Like he does not, like at that point, he was going to be like, I don't want any stuff. Right? Don't buy like a nicer bed. Like just leave me in the one that they give me. Yeah, those things are super important. Do that planning ahead of time.
Yeah, I think that is important. We had Ashley Kwame on a previous episode talking about some of the relationship dynamics in retirement. And that was one of the biggest things she mentioned was somebody as a financial therapist coming in and working with families when there are disagreements about those things or kind of coaching people how to have those kinds of difficult conversations because it's not easy for sure. So, kind of along the same lines, you mentioned earlier about Medicare, but there's a lot of potential legislative risk in a retirement plan with changes to things like Medicare, but also things like Social Security. There's certainly been headlines about potential changes there, as well as tax laws and things. How do you see these shifts affecting retirement income planning that's being done today or overall financial security for individuals who are thinking about retiring in, say, the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah. So when I talk about retirement income planning, my analogy has always been is trying to hit a moving target in the wind. The target's your goals, what you want to accomplish, that it's moving up and back because we don't know how long you're going to live. And there's wind because that's the public policy. That's all those things that are going to change along the way. Look, there's public policy changes every month, right? There's tax laws, there's regulatory changes inside of Medicare, Medicaid every month that are getting passed and modified at the state level and at the federal level, right? Like these things are constantly in flux. So we will experience public policy change throughout the course of retirement every year. Some are small and some are large, right? Like that's the next part of it. Some you don't really notice, like when your city wage tax goes from 3.1 to 3.15%. It was a change. Honestly, we didn't notice it, right? Like it moved the $200 and that was it. But it's a change and it does have a negative impact maybe for our spending. The ones that are big, although some people will take this that way, this is not a political conversation. Although, right, anytime you see public policy change, it is political, right? Because our government drives public policy. So, but for me, I have for 15 years kind of taken this pathway, and I decided back then that like I think it's really important to have voices out there defending Social Security. because I wrote an article, probably 13 years ago, that this pathway, both due to the funding and some of the like a self belief in Social Security, I thought was going to, kind of become a self fulfilling prophecy. But, Social Security has been arguably the most successful financial instrument ever built. It runs with an overhead of 0.3 to 0.4%. So anytime anybody wants to talk about how inefficient Social Security is, I'm like, just show me a single company that runs with a more efficient overhead. Just one. There isn't, right? It has no marketing, it has no training, it has no sales element of it, it has no R&D. When you look at all of those things, you're like, oh, yeah, like there is no company that can match up to Social Security, which is why there is no annuity that has long term ever done a better payout in mass. There's no investment, like there is nothing, because once you get down to it, like this is a hyper efficient solution because everybody's essentially part of it, right? There's no sales. We don't have to convince people. So we actually get almost perfect mortality pooling inside of Social Security. So it is the most efficient financial instrument ever built. Now, we don't always update it correctly. That is kind of where we've been left to, is that as people have lived longer, even really, I'd say compensation changes in the workforce have occurred, family dynamics have changed. We have not continued to update Social Security at the level we should have. So it does need adjustments because otherwise the fund will run out of money and we'll have to make changes. But it's kind of a math formula if it stays as it is, right? Like you have X amount of money coming out the spigot, and to keep that amount, you need to keep the same kind of flow coming in and mixing around. So you can either turn up or down the flow in, or turn up or down the flow out, or both of those together. But you can't have the flow in being less than the flow you expect to come out, right? That doesn't work. So, uh, that's kind of where we are. But Social Security has been hyper effective at what it was designed to do. So, Social Security was there because Americans were in retirement and in poverty. And we had a bunch of our seniors that were helping build this country up, make it great, and then couldn't live through retirement. So the government said, look, like, let's make a system that covers basically everyone and keeps seniors out of poverty. And that's what it was designed to do. And still to this day, our senior population, who is not working, has less poverty than the country as a whole. We keep seniors out of poverty with Social Security. And for about 1/3 of Americans, it's really their only source of retirement income. And for about 2/3 of Americans, it represents over half of all their retirement income. It's super important for that, kind of 80% of the country. It's probably only about 20% where, really the vast majority of their income will come from Ks and other resources. So, most of this country needs Social Security to maintain anything close to their standard of living today.
That would help explain why, when they talk about making changes to it, you get some of the visceral reactions that you get from the public, right? Because it is something that's become pretty ingrained and people are depending upon it. I like your framing there about how you described its intended purpose, really being insurance against poverty and old age. That's not really always how it's discussed or how it's
No,
considered, but that really is the role that it should be playing in someone's plan.
it's
That's
actually
good.
in the name of it if you read the whole name, right? Which
Right.
right? It's
Sure.
it's old age insurance, and like that's exactly what it was for.
That's right.
Yeah, there was an argument that should we make Social Security more of an individual investment account at one point in time, and I was like, look, I like individual investment accounts. The problem with that is it doesn't solve any of that issue, right? People will spend it, and then when they're 82, we won't have a lifetime income source that's adjusting for inflation, and we can't say, well, then those people can just go buy an annuity. Well, it's like, well, you can, but like it still can't pull the same because annuities get a very small fraction of the overall population. And interestingly enough, right, we have a purchasing bias that occurs in annuities where people who are going to live longer are the only ones that purchase annuities. So it's amazing. Annuity owners live much longer than the average person. And it's so, it's always a little bit of a joke there, right? Like that you buy the annuity and you live longer, but it's not really what's occurring, right? It's people who expect to live a long time are the ones that go out and purchase it. So it actually causes the cost of that to be higher because we don't get the mortality pooling from the people who die earlier.
Right. Yeah, you get some selection bias there, and that can certainly influence the costs on the front end for sure.
The biggest other risk that I see across the board, we've kind of been like dancing around the sides of, which is this kind of lack of execution and follow through risk. And I think
Mm,
that's probably the biggest one out. Like that's in that top three now for me is that, and you see this because you work with clients and advisors, right? Which is how many clients say they were going to put something in place and never get it in place. It is over and over and over and over and over again. And you see it with high net worth clients don't have estate plans. You look at somebody like Prince, which was, he's an absolutely brilliant musician, very wealthy, was even sick leading up to his death, got carried off of a plane on a stretcher, died without a will or trust in place with like one of the more complex estate plans you can probably have. Cause like, how do you split up Purple Rain? Like that's hard, right? But this happens over and over and over again. So we do have this huge risk out there of just lack of execution that people do planning. They meet with advisors, trusts don't get funded, the documents don't get updated, and they never have the conversation with their kids. And a big part of the advisor's job to me is to frame these things in a way that allows people to make informed decisions. And if the informed decision is I'm not doing it because it's too expensive, like that's totally fine. But we shouldn't land in the boat, oh yeah, I should do that, but I just never got around to it, right? Like that's the part that getting things across the finish line to me is super important and probably, kind of like longevity, like that's a risk exacerbator across all these because every time one falls down there, it's leading to two or three other problems. So, whether you're keeping a checklist, you're knocking them off, right? Like, how do we make this easier for people so they can actually do the things in the planning world that they should be doing, following through and making sure the plans actually rolled out? Because the best plan in the world that's not implemented is the worst plan in the world.
That's really, really good advice because it's pretty common for us to hear from folks as they think about retirement about not wanting to be a burden to their children or to other family members. But what better way to not be a burden than to actually follow through on putting the recommendations of a professional into place so that they can be certain that things are carried out according to their wishes after they're not here? Would you agree?
Yeah, 100%. Talking about it and thinking about it are different than doing it, right? And ultimately, this is a space where action is required. Inaction will always lead to problems here, right? There's not an inactive plan that works.
So you've written a book. You mentioned a book, but your book, Rewirement, rewiring the way that you think about retirement. Can you share with listeners, just at a high level, what the title means to you and why you called it that?
Yeah, yeah. I actually trademarked that too years ago. So I came up with it and started using it in seminars and then wrote the book. But I was sitting there, I just finished up whatever they call it now. Actually, it's not what I call it, but I heard it at the event. American Colleges calls it something now. But at the time, it was just the retirement income literacy quiz. And that was it. We didn't have like an acronym for it. When we did that, what I found out was most Americans are actually fairly financially literate by the time they get to retirement off of the core financial literacy metrics, right? It's compound interest and time value of money and stuff like that because we've lived through it. We have experiences around it. We understand it. But what we found was most Americans did not have retirement income literacy. And it makes sense because we've never lived through retirement yet. So, like, we don't have those experiences and knowledge, and our system doesn't teach us anything about that. Like it teaches us about saving, it does not teach us about spending in retirement. And so what I realized was like that people needed to change the way they think from this savings mentality and what a traditional financially literate or knowledgeable person would be considered to like what actually matters now in retirement is no longer compound interest and saving every month, right? It's like, how do I spend this down safely? So it required this shift in mindset from the accumulation world to the decumulation world. And then I realized like there were three or four other things we needed to change our mindset on, right? From moving from the notion of up and to the right and just keep saving to actually it being good that the money might be coming out. Like that's another dynamic change. The other one was like, how do we get meaning and value out of life? Because most people get that out of their communities and their work. And when that stops, while retirees are on average happier than they were before, we have more people that are depressed in retirement than the average population, too, because so many people actually lose their meaning. So, what you get is this kind of weird move where like the average shifts positive, but we actually have a larger group that goes to depression. And then another group that's really happy because they hated their job, right? And like it's done. They're super happy. But we have a big group that struggles to find meaning, and that's another mindset shift. So all of these things came in this notion of like we really do need to change the way that we think heading into retirement. So then I came up with that kind of interesting rewirement. I really did it at the time though. Like the trademark thing was funny because I did that so no big company eventually took it and then told me I couldn't have it for the book. And I do see more and more people using it out there nowadays. There's the attorney part of me that's like, I'm supposed to send them letters. Ultimately, I like seeing it used. Like it's a good thing, right?
Sure, sure, sure. Absolutely. So, as we start to wrap up, Jamie, what's one piece of advice that you can share with listeners just to kind of sum all of this up based on your experience?
Yeah, so I will go to this one because it's one of my favorite phrases around this. Is a lot of times we approach this retirement income planning process like in the notion of success and failure. Did we save enough? Do we have enough money to live throughout retirement? And we look at it in an incredibly binary manner. Like, did we save enough for retirement? Well, there's never enough, right? Every client I've ever worked with across the entire spectrum of wealth. And I've worked with billionaires that own professional sports teams. And I'll tell you, all of them have some anxiety and concern around money. There's not a single one that doesn't. And so there's never enough. And when you look at retirement, it's not binary. There is no success or failure, right? It's life. It's going to be messy. There's going to be ups and downs. It's really not about like, do we have enough, to make it throughout all of retirement? Do we have enough to live a good life? And are we willing to make the changes and adapt along the way, in a manner that is going to keep us on path for the things we really want to do? And life is full of trade-offs. Right? Nobody gets to do everything they want to do. Everybody has to decide on trade-offs on how you're going to spend time and prioritize. And that's mostly what ends up being retirement is trying to make the trade-offs and prioritize the right things for you.
Well, I think that's great advice. And, perhaps the biggest risk to sum that up is the risk of not planning and under enjoying retirement.
I think we talked about this before too once, and I saw a story this week or last week that talked about I think it was a janitor at Ford who died with like $7 million, and
Mhm.
I just kept saying like I read the article and it was like praising here's how you become a millionaire, with a normal job, and I was like, man, this story sucks. Like this guy could have done so many other things, and I didn't know him. Maybe he was the happiest guy in the history of the world. But the story on its face to me is actually not a story of success. It's a story of, not living the life that you could have lived because he probably had some scarcity mindset around money and never felt permission to spend. I could be wrong about that, but you see that a lot is that you see people with money and they're scared. They've self insured a lot of the risks in retirement, which was another concept we didn't get into a lot. But if you self insure every risk, you tend to hoard the money because you can't spend it. So then Wade Pfau and I actually used to talk about this. There's liquidity and true liquidity. If all of your money is self insuring, a legacy value, estate taxes, long term health care, you don't have any true liquidity because it's actually all bundled up for some future cost. So you can't actually spend it. And therefore, you live this kind of subpar retirement because that money's not real, it's booked for the future.
I think that's an excellent place to wrap this up because you're absolutely right. And that's probably one of the least salient risks that it looks like you have a lot of money on the balance sheet. But to your point, if it's already spent or it's allocated to future spending, then you really have none at all. As we start to wrap up, since this is a show about retirement, I'm curious to hear at this point in your life and your career what retirement means to you personally.
Yeah, so it's definitely going to continue to change. So there was a time period where my vision of myself in retirement was writing books. So we talked about it. I wanted to be a writer, and it wouldn't be retirement books anymore. I actually, which is a not well known fact about me, I wrote two plays right out of college. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to write movies, and I wrote two. They did not get made. I did go around and pitch one. We found one small indie kind of place that was going to fund it, and I ended up not making that my career choice, which is probably the right one. But I love that. I'm working on another book with Harriman House right now, which will come out beginning of next year, and then I'm working on a running book too. Now, as I said, like I always thought I'd never really retire. I just write books to the end of my life, and kind of continue to do that whenever I was done in the financial world. However, I think ChatGPT and the rise of AI writing tools have made me think like that's not a real thing. Like I'm probably not going to do that anymore. it seems gone. Like I wish AI was doing stuff like the laundry and not making movies and writing books. Like, we want you to do the laundry and cut the yard and like clean up the house, AI, not take away art for us. But yeah, like that notion of what am I going to do very much shifted. To some degree, I fall in the group of people that kind of hopes they never fully retire. That is really where I sit. It doesn't mean I won't stop working for because of money at some point, but I kind of hope to stay engaged and continue to work until as close to the day I die as possible. I was with Richard Branson recently, and somebody asked him, like, what do you want to do? And he said, I want to be alive as long as I can still play tennis. And that's kind of a similar thing. There's the things I still enjoy and love. I want to be able to do those. And I stopped my running streak because I want to be healthy for my grandkids and maybe even my great grandkids. So I made a change around the way I was treating my body and kind of pushing myself in extreme sports to be healthier long term. And that was a cognitive decision I made in my 30s, right? So for 50 years from now, Jamie.
Very good. Yeah, your future self, right?
Yep.
Well, Jamie, this has been a real pleasure. I appreciate you taking some time out of your busy schedule to come on and share all this terrific information with us. If listeners want to learn more about you and your work, where can they find you?
So I'll give you three places. So one is LinkedIn. You can type in Jamie Hopkins in there, and I should show up. It's actually, I think my tag thing is now Jamie Hopkins Financial Services is actually my name in there from the landing page in there. BMT.com is my daytime job, Rimar Trust. We're really in that trust space for individuals and advisory firms. We didn't really talk about it, but a lot of my work now is also giving back to develop this next generation of advisors at FinServ Foundation. But any of those, you could get to me via email or LinkedIn, and I'm pretty responsive to most stuff that comes on LinkedIn, unless you tell me you have a new, sales tool that will increase my sales by 300% this month. Those I usually do not respond back to.
Fair enough. Well, hopefully we can have you back when your new book is out and you can share that with our audience as well. But Jamie Hopkins, everyone. Jamie, thank you so much again for joining us on the Intelligent Retirement Podcast.
Thank you.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered tax, legal, or investment advice. Although the information has been gathered from sources that are believed to be reliable, please keep in mind that individual situations may vary. Therefore, the information should only be acted upon when coordinated with individual professional advice. Guest speakers and their firms are not affiliated with or endorsed by Park Avenue Securities, Guardian, Intelligent Retirement, or Consolidated Planning, and all views and opinions stated are their own. Guardian, its subsidiaries, agents, and employees do not provide tax, legal, or accounting advice. Consult your tax, legal, or accounting professional regarding your individual situation. All investments and investment strategies contain risk and may lose value. James Matthews is a registered principal and financial advisor of Park Avenue Securities, LLC. Securities products and advisory services are offered through Park Avenue Securities, member FINRA, SIPC. James Matthews is a financial representative of the Guardian Life Insurance Company of America, New York, New York. Park Avenue Securities is a wholly owned subsidiary of Guardian. Consolidated Planning and Intelligent Retirement are not affiliates or subsidiaries of Park Avenue Securities or Guardian. Compliance ID 80153441 expires June 2027.